The Water Bird. Far ahead, to the left, below the highway, the river wound like a shiny soft ribbon, floating in a sea of dark greenness. It enchanted Ai-ling and Tian-chung. They were driving back from their honeymoon trip in Miami. In another 30 miles or so they would be back in New York City. They exited on a side road and drove toward the river. The late spring sun was casting a lazy shade of gold on the now and then disappearing river among the dense trees. A tall white apartment building with 2 wings stretched out like a big water bird rose above the woods. How nice would it be if they could live and hide there? The manager told them there were long-distance buses to New York every half hour or so during weekday rush hours. The lease would be for 1 year only. He took them to an 8th-floor apartment facing the river. It was luxuriously designed, off-white walls, new thick off-white carpets, which made one want to lie down on them. The panoramic view from the windows showed the setting sun and golden dusk over the trees. A light mist had risen from the river. If they lived there, they had only to commute to the city to work. On weekends they could dip their feet in the river, taking long walks along its banks, picnicking in the woods, and lying on the soft grass, watching the first star appearing in the sky. 2 Saturdays later, they moved into the new apartment. As soon as the moving van left, they dropped everything and ran downstairs to the river. A strong smell of sulfur came from the direction of the river as they ran down the steps. When they approached the wood, the odor became stronger. The enchanted river was barren. The banks had a thick layer of black residue-like substance. The odor invaded their nostrils. The color of the water was rust brown. 2 weeks of anticipation had instantly turned into fatigue. They dragged themselves back to the apartment. Ai-ling and Tian-chung started the 4-hour daily commute to the city. Ai-ling couldn't stop her yawning at the office. During weekends, they had only enough energy to sit in front of the window and look at the river from a distance. The woods were still alluringly green, but when the wind was blowing in their direction, they had to close the windows to ward off the offensive smell. Their next-door neighbor was the widow of a local doctor. She had silver hair and a slightly haunched left shoulder. She told Ai-ling and Tian-chung that during the 1920s the river was clear and there were plenty of water plants along the shore. Perch and bass were abundant. People fished on the banks all day. Waterbirds made their home in the marshes nearby. Every Sunday there was boating on the river and picnics in the woods. She met her husband, then an intern, on a boating party. She showed Ai-ling an album with faded gold letters on the cover. On the faded picture, he was still handsome in his suit, and she had a ribbon in her long hair. But since the 1920s, the area had become a pharmaceutical manufacturing center. All the big companies dumped their chemical waste into the river. There was no law prohibiting such activities back then. Soon the river was poisoned to death. The water plants and fishes quickly disappeared, and no waterbirds stayed any longer. "Why did you stay here?" Ai-ling asked her. She said this was still the place she loved the most. She loved the simple life of the small city and the scenery along the river. She could tolerate its odor. Furthermore, she and her husband had met on the river. She had left before, but she had always come back. "As soon as the apartment building was built, I moved in," she said. Her voice trembled a little. "I'll probably stay until I retire to an old folks' home." After a few months of commuting, Ai-ling and Tian-chung could do nothing but go to work. When autumn came, their friends who lived in the city started their seasonal opera and concert going. Those events they had frequented before were now alien to them, and their not yet 6-months-old marriage had felt like a century long. When they thought about trudging in the snow to the bus station in the winter, they started to think things over. The leaves of a few trees in the woods were turning yellow. Finally, they advertised in the newspapers to sublet their apartment. That weekend, a young couple came. They fell immediately in love with the apartment and were going to get married that Thanksgiving. They couldn't believe that Ai-ling and Tian-chung wanted to give up the apartment. What could they say? They said the commuting was too taxing. The couple commented that the city was noisy and unsafe. They said that they had already gotten used to all that. They missed the concerts and the museums, and if the young couple was willing to take over the lease, they would give them half a month rent-free. The moving company again loaded Eiling and Tian Chung's things into the van. Eiling knocked on their neighbor's door. She wasn't in. Eiling left a pot of evergreen by her door and a note to say goodbye. They went back to the empty apartment to take a last look. The off-white walls and the thick carpet were still new. Outside the window, far away, the woods had turned burning red overnight. The river, which had been love at first sight, was more beautiful than ever. Eiling put on her coat, and they closed the door behind them.